because the more that they support Russia, the less they are supporting Ukraine's sovereignty, and therefore the less they are supporting the call for their own sovereignty of unifying with Taiwan.
Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Neilo, a regular podcast that brings you news and views from around the world. If this is your first time checking out our podcast, you might also enjoy some of our past episodes, which are all listed on our blog site at pwneilo.com. In this episode, I'm chatting with Alex Davey, analyst and editor at MERICS, the Mercator Institute for China Studies in Germany. As the world recently marked the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, increased attention is being paid to China's role and its influence on the situation. On the week of February 20th, China's top diplomat, Wang Yi, visited Europe, attended the Munich Security Conference, and then travelled to Russia to meet Vladimir Putin. A few days before his arrival in Moscow, China had abstained from a UN resolution on the principles of the UN Charter and the need for peace in Ukraine. China claimed to be neutral and have talked a lot about peace, sovereignty and territorial integrity, and have also put forward a 12-point peace plan, officially entitled A Position on the Political Settlement of the Ukraine Crisis. But at the same time, China have also announced that they are deepening their relations with Russia. I spoke to Alex about China's ability to broker peace, the current perception of China in Europe, and the latest on Ireland's engagement with China, including Eamon Ryan's high-profile St. Patrick's Day visit to Beijing. Alex, you're very welcome to Perspectives with Neilo. There seems to be a lot of contradictions in China's behaviour. And an article written by your colleagues at MERICS entitled Keeping Up Appearances, China's Support for Russia 1 year into the war describes it as pro-Russian neutrality or the Beijing Straddle or a Chinese balancing act. So, Alex, can you tell us exactly what's been going on?
Thanks very much, Neil. So regarding China's position on the war in Ukraine, China can be seen as being between a rock and a hard place. First of all, the Chinese don't call it the war in Ukraine or Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They simply label it the Ukraine crisis. So what does this mean? It means that there are two positions that they need to navigate between. One is their support for this idea of territorial integrity and sovereignty. So this is the sovereignty of all countries, whether that be Ukraine or itself, and itself being key in part of this positioning they have. The other point is on Russia, their neighbor, where they share over 4,000 kilometers worth of border, and a neighbor that they have been building ties with over the last 20, 30 years since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And regarding this term, Russian or pro-Russian neutrality, there are a number of reasons why this has been seen this way. We have, like you said, Wang Yi visit to Moscow, and now we're expecting a visit from Xi Jinping. He has just been re-elected as president of the People's Republic of China for an unprecedented third time. And it is typical after this, after a new election, that the president of China will visit its largest neighbor, Russia, and this will also fall into this discourse of Russia-leaning neutrality, even though that this is a common practice for a new Chinese president. So there are other reasons for this being seen as Russia-leaning neutrality. For example, China has aligned with Russian narratives and has criticized the West. You also had the speech from Li Jianshu, who was the president of the National People's Congress. This is the legislature, the Chinese legislature, and there's a recorded meeting of him saying that that China fully supported Moscow's need to secure its core interests. And he had said that Russia had been cornered and was counterattacking. So for many of these reasons, we can see that this is a Russian-leaning neutrality. But there is a balancing act to be carried out here between defending both interests of sovereignty and supporting Russia.
And it seems in the media, there's been different reaction to this plan, or to give it its proper title again, this position on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. One commentator said that China's vague plan is aimed not at actually ending the war, but at impressing the developing world and rebutting accusations that Beijing has become a silent accomplice to Moscow. That was a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment said that. And then I see an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal on the 1st of March, where Richard Lawless, who is US Undersecretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs between 2002 and 2008, he said this compromise initiative comes to us with the attendant hustle by the Chinese propaganda machine to register an international signal that is designed to distract from the obvious, which is a continuing Chinese lean in to support Vladimir Putin. Just kind of as you've said, what's your impression of China's proposal and their ability to broker peace in this situation?
So China's ability to broker peace on the Ukraine war. So we have seen this 12-point plan that has been released. What is interesting is that the Chinese had named it a position paper, and it was taken up by Western media as a peace plan. So there was a heightened sense to what the Chinese were doing. But unfortunately, it turned out to be a reiteration of long-standing points and positions on the war. And the problem with that is that it lacks any concrete steps of how to enact their points on, how peace will be brought to Ukraine. And so in this sense, it can be seen that China won't broker peace. And they're trying to make assessments that considers both sides. But there is nothing tangible about how this will be done.
But speaking of both sides, though, they've never sent a diplomat to Ukraine, even though I've read President Zelensky has requested a meeting with China. Am I correct in that?
Yes. So Xi Jinping and Vladimir Zelensky have not had any direct contact. But there have been 3 engagements between Wang Yi and Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba. So you're right, there is a misalignment here of contact between the Chinese and the Ukrainian side versus the Chinese and the Russian side. And I think that is a clear signal. The deficit in engagements between the Ukrainians and the Chinese is there is I would say, yes, a deafening silence there. And it does make their point of support for sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, it does somehow fall short when there is this lack of engagement.
Okay, and speaking about that, I mean, this is something, especially at the Munich Security Conference, we heard Wang Yi talk a lot about sovereignty and territorial integrity. He just mentions it so many times you can't miss it. And even though China fails to call Russia's war on Ukraine an invasion, how much do you think China's so-called plan is a propaganda attempt at grooming for a Taiwan invasion?
There is a connection here between China's call for territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and its own territorial sovereignty. So when China is pushing this line about respecting the borders and the sovereignty of a country, they are talking about themselves. And at the Munich Security Conference, there was retired PLA General Joe Bo. He speaks about this, and it's interesting because the Chinese often don't like this comparison between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's potential invasion of Taiwan. What the Chinese do compare is Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and also China's territorial integrity and sovereignty. So when they're talking about this, they are talking about China being, as to quote Joe Bo, a not yet unified country. and so they are signaling that respecting Ukraine's borders is about also respecting all borders, which includes China's borders. And for China, that involves Taiwan being part of their borders. So that's what they're really saying when they're talking about this support. And that is why when China increases its support for Russia, it is undermining its own talking point about support for sovereignty, because the more that they support Russia, the less they are supporting Ukraine's sovereignty, and therefore the less they are supporting their call for their own sovereignty of unifying with Taiwan. And so that's where, that's the crux.
Okay. But they've been doing, China and the CCP have been doing a lot to show support for Russia recently, like joint military exercises, ongoing trade. In fact, the MERICS article lists 5 items that are really undermining China's so-called neutral stance. Would you be able to give us maybe a short summary of what those kind of 5 things are that are listed in the article?
Yeah, so yeah, like we had spoken about a little bit earlier, we had mentioned the strength of Sino-Russian relations with Wang Yi's visit to Moscow. We talk about the 13 high-level exchanges between Chinese and Russian officials since the war started. And then the lack of engagement between China and Ukraine, where Xi Jinping and Zelensky have not directly engaged. The other points are, like you said, China's increased trade with Russia since the war began. So Chinese imports from Russia have risen by 43% in 2022. And I think that's important to note, because Russia has lost a lot of trading partners since sanctions have come in, and we don't know for sure. But if China had also followed suit by stopping its trade with Russia, what kind of situation would Russia be in today? That is important to note. Regarding these other points of China's military exercises and strategic coordination with Russia, yes, we did see a naval exercise off the south coast of South Africa with the South Africans, the Russians, and the Chinese. But these military and exercise and strategic coordination has been growing over many years. So it's important to note that there are these ties between China and Russia, but that they are developments over a longer period of time. And there are alignments in Russia and China's interests, but they wouldn't be totally aligned. And one of the greatest points of alignment is their dissatisfaction with the U.S. and the U.S. position in the world, and that doesn't always make for a very solid a partnership, let's just say, because it's a shared interest of a disapproval of the international world order, but rather it's sharing something that's negative rather than sharing something that's positive, of what they're trying to achieve or what they're going towards. And that's why, even though we do see these points of for example, the Chinese abstaining from a UN resolution on the need for peace in Ukraine, which would signal some sort of Russian-leaning neutrality. We don't know how close this relationship is. Is it skin deep, or does it go further? And that's the question that we're all trying to answer still.
And I guess relating to Europe's perception of all of this, I saw that the Chinese ambassador to the EU, Fu Kong, was quoted recently by the Global Times, which is Chinese state media. He said that EU leaders may visit China by mid-2023. I think he's referring to French President Emmanuel Macron and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. How do you think EU leaders view China's behaviour, and how do you think they can rationalise continuing to have normal relations with China in light of these items you just mentioned?
So the EU leaders, they have a wide variety of views on and relationship when it comes to China. And sometimes that stands to benefit the Chinese in the sense of a diversity of views. With regard to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Western leaders of, Scholz, Macron, Meloni, etc., they obviously stand on the side of Ukraine and are, trying to aid the Ukraine to not only win this war, but also to have Russia leave its territory. So in that sense, when they saw the peace plan, they were not very. There was not much confidence expressed from these leaders. However, on the other side, you have someone like Viktor Orban, the Hungarian leader, who has come out vocally supporting it. And then you obviously have an ally of China or a strong partner of Lukashenko of Belarus, who has also come to support it. Where China usually now will focus is on a country somewhere like France. France is under Emmanuel Macron. They have this idea of strategic autonomy. France has been the leader of this idea, and the Chinese repeatedly call on the EU to support strategic autonomy. What that will mean, however, is that yes, the EU is aware of reliance on the US, especially on the war in Ukraine for arms, but the EU is also aware of the implications of an economic dependence on the US. So whereas the EU is aware of its own straddle between the US and China, it will not follow a strategic autonomy that the Chinese put forward, which is one that says, the US is very problematic, and you know what, you should trade more with us because we will not interfere with you. So the EU will focus on trying to maintain its autonomy, but not in the way that China prescribes it.
Okay, and you mentioned trade there. Angela Merkel was the one who believed in change through trade. But I guess in the last year or so, we've seen the dangers of being dependent on authoritarian states like Russia via the Nord Stream pipelines for oil and gas, and in the case of Germany. And also, they've also, of course, been building trade links with China, particularly in automotive and the chemical industry. Olaf Scholz was the first foreign leader and indeed EU leader to visit Xi Jinping in person after the 20th National Congress, where the Chinese leader cemented his unprecedented third term, as you mentioned earlier. Do you think Germany under Olaf Scholz still believe in this change through trade concept after all that's been happening in this past few months?
Well, I think ever since the first invasion of Ukraine back in 2014, this idea of change through trade was, that was the beginning of the end. It was slowly starting to peter out. And I think that on February 24th last year, it abruptly ended. This idea was, something that was held within the EU for the last couple of decades. And, with Russia, I suppose, yes, 2014, but also early in the 2000s, I believe it's around 2005, you had Vladimir Putin at the Munich Security Conference talking about Russia going its own way and regarding its own security and not following this Western liberal-based rules order. And with regard to China, it's seen that China has been able to put up a defense or a wall and has been very much aware of this change through trade attitude put forward by the EU and the US. And so it's something that at the same time was seen as morally good from the EU side or from a European side, but also as something that was extremely lucrative, especially for certain businesses trading with the likes of Russia and China, and especially when we look at Russia with regards to energy imports, etc. So there was both a beneficial profit incentive, but also a moral incentive, and once the moral incentive was seen as no longer plausible, the profit one was seen as, that can't hold much longer. And so this has been petering out, but now abruptly ended last year with the full-scale invasion.
Would we still see Germany again reaching out? Lots of pressure clearly from their automotive industry and other large industries in Germany to trade with China. How convinced are they that this is no longer viable? I find it hard to believe that they will decouple completely.
Of course, yes. There's no full expectation of a decoupling between European countries and China, and especially for Germany to decouple from China. What now Germany and other European countries look at is what kind of dependencies European countries have with China. How can they de-risk such dependencies by looking for by diversifying through looking for alternative partners, and also looking at the composition of trade. What are we trading with the Chinese, and what are they trading with us? And I think that if there's an element where if we're importing a lot of high tech products from China and we're exporting low tech products, that is a problematic issue of there is an imbalance and there is a leverage that the Chinese may have. So it's about trying to look to make sure that there is not such a high dependency, and looking at the economic security of European countries, because something like decoupling is not realistic, and it would be an economic nightmare if we suddenly decided to decouple tomorrow. For many of these economies.
Deputy Prime Minister and Taoiseach Micheál Martin met Wang Yi on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference back in February. And it was recently announced that Eamon Ryan, who is the Minister for Environment, Climate, Communications and Transport, is travelling to China to represent Ireland as part of the annual St. Patrick's Day celebration. So my question is, what do you make of Ireland's ongoing relationship and engagement with China?
So Ireland's ongoing relationship with China is something to be looked at the moment, for sure. And mentioning Micheál Martin's meeting with Wang Yi on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference is a very interesting and contemporary point to bring up. And what I found interesting about that meeting was that the Chinese side provided a meeting readout of their meeting, where the Irish side did not. And Micheál Martin had posted that on Twitter that they had met, but we don't know about what. Looking at the Chinese readout, I think the key point for the Chinese was about Ireland not interfering or not putting on any regulations on Chinese companies in Ireland. There was a specific line where the Chinese said, or the Chinese readout said, treat the Chinese enterprises in a fair, just and non-discriminatory manner. And so that was really pointing at maybe Huawei's position in Ireland and other Chinese companies, enterprises that operate in Ireland, and to protect them.
And they were also very, and they were all, sorry to interrupt you, they were also very quick to point out that Ireland strictly adheres, or that apparently Micheál Martin said Ireland strictly adheres to the one China policy. Yeah, that was also part of their of the state media report.
Yes. And I think if for Ireland to say that they adhere to the one China policy, I think that is an acceptable message for both sides, because the Chinese want to put forward their one China policy, but when we say we support the one China policy, we say, okay, there's one China, but we're not saying something like Taiwan is an inalienable part of this one China. So it's very it's not so specific that it puts Micheál Martin under pressure to reiterate something that maybe he does not want to. And I think for that to be included, on the other side, you had the two sides also exchange views on Ukraine and other issues. And I imagine that was Micheál Martin's goal from that meeting, to be able to talk to Wang Yi and see Ireland as somewhat as a broker or as an influencer on the side of to the Chinese on what they're doing with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Just regarding the Irish visits on St. Patrick's Day,
yes.
You had brought up this point that we'll have Eamon Ryan visiting Beijing on St. Patrick's Day this year. And I think that is interesting because, for the last 3 years, we've had no trips to China. And then the last one was in 2019, where then Education Minister Joe McHugh, he went to Finland and then went to China. So sending someone like Eamon Ryan, who would be quite senior and, the third coalition partner in the Irish government, shows that Ireland is making an effort to maintain relations. And I find that very interesting. Of course, we always put the US first. It's always about the bowl of shamrock at the White House and we'll be with Biden for the Taoiseach. But the fact that we are sending Eamon Ryan is something to be noted, and it shows that we're not stepping back as much as I had expected, and trying to maintain this relationship. So I think that's something we can watch and see how it develops.
How do you think Ireland's relationship with China differs to other EU states?
So Ireland has an interesting relationship with China, and it's different in the sense of, well, first of all, Ireland is a smaller country within the EU, and how we relate with China is interesting because of how we relate with the US. Ireland being a country that seeks out foreign direct investment for multinational companies to set up in Ireland, and so Ireland has tried to employ the same policy of the same way we had US companies investing in Ireland, like your Googles, your Facebook, or your Pfizers. The same thing is happening on the other side, where we have Huawei or Wuxi Biologics investing in Ireland. What makes that very interesting is that this becomes a site of US-China competition. And this is why we have Wang Yi saying to Micheál Martin to treat the Chinese enterprises in a fair, just, and non-discriminatory manner, because there is likely to be a competition between Chinese and American influence in Ireland. And in the past we had Vice President Pence, former Vice President Pence, talking about how Ireland should be aware of Huawei and the risks that it brings to having this telecommunications company's hardware in our systems. I think equally, looking at our trade relationship, so we export a lot of agricultural products to China, and China really focuses on its own food security and tries to secure that. And on the one hand, it's trying to improve its self-reliance on food security, but on the other hand, they know that they cannot fully be self-sufficient, and they need countries that they can depend on and rely on, and that have a strong partnership with. And Ireland has offered that, and it has been a steady exporter of pig meat, beef, and lamb. China does have a focus on its food security, and where it is not always self-reliant, it will need partners that it can depend on to supply fundamental core foodstuffs, which Ireland has benefited for many years. But at the same time, a lot of those numbers are dropping as China's self-reliance improves. And so this is where we look at the composition of exports between Ireland and China, and that where we are importing a lot of machinery and probably machinery that is increasing in technology, while we continue to export agricultural products. So yes, we also export pharmaceuticals and and medical machinery to China, but at the same time, a lot of these are products that come from multinational companies that are not directly that are not would not be fully Irish. So what is fully Irish is our agricultural product, and which does bring that brings an economic advantage or tangible outcome, and which is why it is such a priority of the Irish government.
Probably a good segue into the next question is that on February 27th, Jiang Meifang, who is the Chinese Consulate General in Belfast, tweeted the headline from the Chinese state media China Daily editorial, which said the EU should keep its distance from the US so they can work with Beijing for peace. Do you think the EU will heed this warning? Or maybe to put it another way, do you think China's recent actions will succeed in dividing the US and the EU or bring them closer together?
So when we look at Jiang Meifang, the Consulate General in Belfast, first of all, we have to look at what her role is by posting such content online. And Jiang would be a very one of the more successful Chinese diplomats in pursuing the party line for a global audience, in that she has a large following online. She tweets regularly and sometimes quite provocatively. And, for someone at a consulate in Belfast, which may not be the top diplomatic position for a Chinese diplomat, it shows that she's trying to be heard, and it's very much within her best interest in her career to do so. Regarding the message that she's sending of the EU should keep its distance from the US so it can work with Beijing for peace, I think the EU sees this issue, but it will not deal with it in the way that China advocates. So, like I had said earlier, the EU is aware of the implications of a strong economic dependence on the US, and does understand its need to maintain strategic autonomy, but at the same time, it will not do so the way the Chinese want Beijing wants them to, and especially by using the word peace, it's trying to signal that by being away from the US you can reach peace, but that's a strong assumption, and shows that it's a loaded question. That away from the US means peace, so that means by being with the US it's not peaceful, and that's more like a barb or an underhand attack on the US.
So we've talked a lot about the close alliance and the deepening ties between China and Russia, and you also mentioned other dictators like, for example, Lukashenko of Belarus visiting Beijing and proclaiming his support for China. I believe also recently Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi visited Beijing mid-February for a 3-day visit. Some commentators have said that we're seeing dictators organizing in a way that's not been seen before. Do you think this is a worrying development?
So I think the term dictators is an interesting one, because I can't imagine that the Chinese, when they meet with Lukashenko of Belarus or Raisi of Iran, they're going to say, okay, all us dictators, we're going to meet together. I think the Chinese will more see it as who are our potential partners and who all share problems with the US. And they use this as a grounds for shared interest. So all these nations will say that they're all in competition with the US, or they experience tension with the US, and they use that as a common point to meet together. So I think that this is not something to be particularly worried about. This is something that they may even see themselves as the outcasts, or there's oftentimes a victimhood mentality, and that this is something to come together. But as I said, that when there's a shared interest of a negative point of being against the US, rather than having a shared interest of what are we both for, or what do we all share, it doesn't make grounds for a very solid partnerships. That being said, we do have the recent readout of China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, some sort of peace agreement that was brokered by the Chinese side, and this is something we haven't seen before. And rather than seeing this something as a worrying development from Europe, it's very interesting, and it's very something that we should watch, because obviously Saudi Arabia and Iran have very tense relations, and now they've agreed to reopen embassies and send their diplomats to the other country within 2 months. And for China to have brokered this is quite significant, because the Chinese have not been so successful in doing something like this. And second of all, the US is on the outside here. This is the US's territory or sphere where they have operated within, and for them not to be here and not to be part of it is something that's different. Now, to see if this stands or if this comes to fruition and is yet to be seen, because the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran are so high, and they've had such a difficult relationship over the decades. So it's very interesting and something to keep watching, but at the same time, we won't hold our breath yet.
My thanks to Alex Davey, analyst and editor at MERICS, for joining us on Perspectives with Neilo. And you can find out more about Alex's work on the MERICS website, which we have linked in our blog, along with some additional links and references for you to dive deeper into today's topic. You can find it all at pwneilo.com. And don't forget, you can also follow Perspectives with Neilo on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Instagram and Twitter. Well, that's it for the moment. Until the next time, thank you for listening. Slán agus beannacht.